London, February 1915. In the ornate conference room of the Admiralty Building in London, First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill stood before a large map of the Ottoman Empire. His finger traced the narrow waterway of the Dardanelles Strait, a sliver of water that separated Europe from Asia, the gateway to Constantinople and the Black Sea beyond. "Gentlemen," Churchill declared with characteristic confidence, "this is where we shall break the stalemate. Not in the muddy trenches of France, but here, in the eastern Mediterranean. One bold stroke, and we change the course of the war." Around the table sat the architects of Britain's war effort, admirals in gold braid, generals with chests full of medals, politicians calculating the costs of failure. They studied the map with varying degrees of enthusiasm and skepticism. The logic was seductive. The Western Front had become a butcher's yard where thousands died for yards of worthless mud. Russia, Britain's ally, was desperately short of supplies and could only be reached through the Turkish-controlled straits. If the Royal Navy could force the Dardanelles, capture Constantinople and knock Turkey out of the war, they could open a supply route to Russia, threaten Germany from the south, and potentially bring neutral Balkan nations into the war on the Allied side. It would be, Churchill insisted, a masterpiece of strategic thinking. Admiral Sir John Fisher, the first Sea Lord, was less convinced. At 74 years old, he'd seen too many masterpieces collapse into disasters. "The Dardanelles are heavily fortified," he warned. "Shore batteries, mines, mobile howitzers. Ships alone won't force the strait. We'll need troops." "Then we'll send troops," Churchill replied smoothly. "But the Navy will lead the way. British ships have ruled the seas for 200 years. Turkish forts will crumble before our guns." What none of them fully appreciated was that they were planning to attack one of the most naturally defensible positions on Earth, a narrow strait overlooked by heights on both sides, where any attacking force would be channeled into killing zones that defenders had studied for centuries. The Ottoman Empire might be the sick man of Europe, as the diplomats liked to say, but it was about to show that sick men could still fight. The Gallipoli Peninsula, a finger of land pointing southwest from European Turkey, was a place of stark beauty. Rocky cliffs dropped to small beaches. Steep gullies cut through scrub-covered hills. Ancient Greek and Roman ruins testified to its strategic importance through millennia. It was also a military nightmare for attackers. The peninsula was narrow, with high ground overlooking any approach. The Turks had spent months fortifying it under the guidance of German military advisors. Artillery positions covered every beach. Trenches networked across the hills. And the defenders had the incalculable advantage of fighting for their homeland. But in London, these realities were reduced to lines on maps and optimistic assessments. The British had never lost a major naval engagement. Their army was the product of centuries of imperial warfare. Turkish forces, they assumed, would break and run when faced with British steel and determination. They were catastrophically wrong. While British planners debated strategy on the other side of the world, young men were answering the call to adventure. In Australia and New Zealand, the declaration of war had sparked a surge of patriotic fervor. Men lined up outside recruiting offices, desperate to do their bit before the war ended, which everyone assumed would be by Christmas 1914. These were the men who would become the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the ANZACs. They came from sheep stations in the outback, from city offices, from farms and factories. Many had never been more than 50 miles from their birthplace. Few had fired a shot in anger. But they came in their thousands, driven by loyalty to empire, thirst for adventure, and the simple conviction that it was the right thing to do. Private Jack Morrison was typical of these volunteers. 22 years old, he'd worked his family's sheep station in western Queensland since he was 14. Life was hard, predictable work, fixing fences, mustering sheep, praying for rain. When war came, it promised something different: travel, excitement, the chance to prove himself. "Don't go getting yourself killed," his mother had said at the train station, her voice carefully controlled. "I'll be back before you know it." "Mum," Jack had replied with the confidence of someone who'd never seen war. "Probably won't even see action. The Navy'll sort out the Turks before we get there." He couldn't have been more wrong. The ANZACs trained in Egypt through the winter of 1914-15. They drilled in the shadow of the pyramids, learned to march in formation, practiced with their rifles. Their officers, many of them veterans of Britain's colonial wars, tried to instill discipline into these irreverent colonials who called officers mate and questioned every order. But what the ANZACs lacked in military polish, they made up for in toughness and initiative. These were men who'd survived droughts, floods, and the harsh conditions of frontier life. They could shoot, ride, and endure hardship. They just didn't know yet what war really meant. Before the ANZACs would get their chance, the Royal Navy attempted to force the Dardanelles by ships alone. On March 18, 1915, a fleet of 18 battleships and cruisers steamed into the strait, their massive guns ready to demolish the Turkish forts. It should have been a triumph of British naval power. The battleships, floating fortresses mounting guns that could hurl shells weighing as much as a small car, represented the pinnacle of military technology. Their armor could withstand all but the heaviest hits. Their firepower was devastating. For the first hours, it seemed the optimists were right. British and French battleships pounded the Turkish forts. Guns were dismounted, ammunition stores exploded, stone walls crumbled. The Turkish fire seemed to be weakening. Then disaster struck. The French battleship Bouvet hit a mine and sank in 2 minutes with the loss of 600 men. The British battleship HMS Irresistible struck a mine and had to be abandoned. HMS Ocean, attempting to aid Irresistible, also struck a mine and sank. HMS Inflexible was severely damaged by mine and shell fire. In a single afternoon, the Navy lost a third of its battleship strength. The Turkish forts, written off as destroyed, opened fire again as soon as the smoke cleared. Shells from mobile howitzers, which couldn't be spotted from the ships, rained down on the fleet. By evening, Admiral de Robeck ordered a withdrawal. The Navy had failed to force the strait. Ships alone weren't enough. It would take boots on the ground. It would take the ANZACs. The sun set over the Aegean Sea as the largest invasion fleet since the Napoleonic Wars assembled off the Gallipoli Peninsula. More than 200 ships filled the waters, battleships and cruisers, destroyers and minesweepers, transports packed with troops, supply vessels laden with ammunition and equipment. Aboard the transport ships, the ANZACs prepared for battle. They'd been given just 24 hours' notice. Most of the briefings had been cursory. Land at Gabatepe, secure the ridges, cut off the Turkish forces to the south. Simple, straightforward. Nothing to worry about. Private Jack Morrison sat with his section, men from Queensland and New South Wales, who'd become closer than brothers over months of training. They cleaned their rifles for the 100th time, checked their ammunition pouches, adjusted their equipment. The joking and banter that usually filled their ranks was subdued. "You scared, Jack?" asked Tommy Chen, whose family had come from China to the goldfields 2 generations back. He was checking the edge of his bayonet, his hand steady despite his question. "Terrified," Jack admitted. "But I reckon we all are. The blokes who say they're not scared are either liars or idiots." Nearby, Sergeant Bill Mackenzie, a veteran of the Boer War, addressed the men in his gravelly voice. "Right, listen up. When we hit that beach, you move fast and you move together. Don't bunch up, makes you an easy target. Don't stop to help wounded men. That's what stretcher bearers are for. Your job is to get off that beach and up to the high ground. Questions? Sarge, what if the beach is hot?" someone asked. Hot meant under fire. Mackenzie's scarred face creased into something like a smile. "Son, assume the beach will be hot. Assume everything will go wrong. War's got a way of ignoring plans. You rely on your mates, you use your head, and you keep moving forward. That's how you survive. And if we can't move forward, then you dig in and you hold your ground until you can. The Navy will be there to support us. Those big guns can flatten anything the Turks throw at us." What Mackenzie couldn't say, was that he'd seen plans fall apart before. He'd seen confident officers lead men to slaughter. He'd learned that war was chaos and survival was often a matter of luck as much as skill. But these boys needed confidence, not doubt, so he gave them what they needed to hear. While the troops prepared, the naval officers were finalizing their fire support plans. Aboard HMS Queen Elizabeth, the fleet's flagship, Admiral de Robeck reviewed the bombardment schedule with his gunnery officers. The Queen Elizabeth was the most powerful warship in the world. Commissioned just 6 months earlier, she was the first battleship powered entirely by oil rather than coal, making her faster and more efficient. Her 8 15-inch guns could hurl a shell weighing nearly a ton over 20 miles with devastating accuracy. Each shell could punch through 3 feet of steel armor or demolish a building with a single hit. We'll begin the preparatory bombardment at 400 hours, de Robeck explained, pointing to the map. The battleships will engage the known Turkish positions on the ridges. The cruisers will suppress the coastal defenses. The destroyers will provide close-in fire support once the troops are ashore. It sounded magnificent. The reality would prove far more complicated. Naval gunfire, for all its awesome power, had severe limitations that would only become apparent in action. Spotting targets from ships miles offshore was difficult. Communication between naval observers and the ships was slow and unreliable. The guns couldn't engage targets on reverse slopes or in deep gullies. And most critically, the Turkish defenders weren't obligingly sitting in fixed positions marked on British maps. Lieutenant Commander Eric Bush, captain of the destroyer HMS Colon, had his own concerns. His ship would be operating close to shore, perhaps dangerously close, to support the landing. Destroyers were fast and maneuverable, but their thin armor made them vulnerable to even small-caliber guns. "We'll take her in to within 500 yards of the beach," Bush told his officers. "Close enough to hit anything we can see. The 4-inch guns should be able to suppress machine gun positions and trenches." "Sir, at that range, even rifle fire could damage us," his first officer pointed out. "I'm aware of the risk," Bush replied, "but those boys in the boats will need all the help they can get. If we have to take a few hits to give them covering fire, that's what we'll do." This was the spirit throughout the fleet. Every officer and sailor knew they were attempting something unprecedented. A major amphibious assault against a defended shore, supported entirely by naval gunfire. There was no doctrine, no proven tactics, no experience to draw on. They would learn by doing, and the price of those lessons would be paid in blood. In a small cabin aboard HMS Queen, Lieutenant Colonel Ewan Sinclair McLagan, commander of the 3rd Brigade, was having a heated discussion with his staff officers. They were reviewing the landing plan, and something wasn't right. "These maps are outdated," Sinclair McLagan said, frustration evident in his voice. "Look at this. The beach at Gaba Tepe is marked as 800 yards wide with a gentle slope behind it. But I've been looking at the coastline through binoculars, and I'm not convinced that's accurate." "Sir, intelligence assures us the maps are reliable," said a young staff captain. "Intelligence has been wrong before," Sinclair McLagan replied. He'd been a soldier long enough to know that intelligence reports were often based on outdated information or wishful thinking. But there was another problem, one that nobody aboard would discover until it was too late. The naval officers responsible for navigating the landing boats to the correct beach had made their calculations based on visual landmarks that would be invisible in the darkness before dawn. The current, running stronger than expected from south to north, would push the boats off course. Instead of landing at Gaba Tepe, a wide beach with relatively gentle slopes behind it, the ANZACs would land a mile to the north at a small cove backed by steep, scrub-covered cliffs. A place that had no name on British maps but would soon be known around the world as ANZAC Cove. This navigation error would turn a difficult operation into a desperate one. Instead of advancing across manageable terrain, the ANZACs would have to scale near vertical cliffs under fire. The naval gunfire, planned to support an advance across open ground, would be largely ineffective against defenders hidden in gullies and behind ridges. But none of this was known as the sun set on April 24th. The men believed in the plan, trusted their officers, and had faith that the Royal Navy's guns would see them through. At midnight, the order came. The troops would begin loading into the boats. 0 hour, the moment of the landing, was set for 4:30 a.m. just before dawn. Jack Morrison and his mates climbed down rope ladders into the wooden boats that would take them to shore. Each boat held about 30 men, packed in so tightly they could barely move. The boats were towed by steam-powered pinnaces, small, flat-bottomed craft that could operate in shallow water. The sea was calm, thank God. A rough sea would have made the approach nearly impossible. But the darkness was absolute. Clouds covered the moon and stars. The men in the boats could see nothing. Not the shore, not even the boats next to them. They sat in darkness, surrounded by darkness, heading toward an enemy they couldn't see. The only sounds were the chug of the pinnace engines and the slap of waves against the wooden hulls. No one spoke. Each man was alone with his thoughts of home, of family, of what the dawn might bring. Jack checked his rifle for the 10th time, feeling the familiar weight of it in his hands. His mouth was dry despite the sea spray. His heart hammered in his chest. This was it. This was what all the training had been for. In a few hours, he'd either be a combat veteran or a casualty statistic. "Remember, boys," Sergeant Mackenzie's voice came softly through the darkness. "Fast off the beach. Find cover. Wait for the order to advance. We do this right, we'll be drinking Turkish coffee by afternoon." It was a comforting lie, and they all knew it. But sometimes comfort mattered more than truth. 30 minutes before the scheduled landing, the naval bombardment commenced. The silence of the night was shattered by the thunder of heavy guns. HMS Queen Elizabeth opened fire first. The blast from her 15-inch guns was like the end of the world, a flash that lit up the entire fleet, followed by a concussion that could be felt in the chest from miles away. The shells screamed through the darkness toward the invisible shore. The other battleships joined in: Triumph, Majestic, Prince of Wales. The cruisers added their fire. The destroyers moved closer, their lighter guns adding to the cacophony. For the men in the boats, the noise was terrifying and reassuring in equal measure. Terrifying because it spoke to the violence they were heading into. Reassuring because surely nothing could survive such firepower. The Turkish defenses must be being obliterated, but in reality the bombardment was largely ineffective. In the darkness, the ships were firing at map coordinates, not visible targets. Many shells overshot their marks, exploding harmlessly on the reverse slopes of ridges. Others fell short, churning up the sea or the empty beaches. And the Turks, warned by the sound of the engines and the naval gunfire, were manning their positions, preparing to greet the invaders with machine gun and rifle fire. The boats continued their slow progress toward shore. 500 yards, 400, 300. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, not dawn yet, but the first hint that night was ending. 200 yards. 100, then the world exploded. The Turkish searchlights blazed to life with shocking suddenness, their powerful beams sweeping across the water and catching the landing boats in brilliant white light. For a frozen instant, time seemed to stop. The ANZACs, caught like actors on a stage, could see the shore clearly for the first time. It was the wrong shore. Instead of the wide, gently sloping beach they'd been briefed about, they faced a narrow strip of sand and shale barely 30 yards wide, backed by cliffs that rose 70 feet almost vertically. The cliffs were covered in thick scrub and broken by steep gullies. And from those cliffs, from those gullies, from positions the ANZACs couldn't even see, came fire. Machine guns opened up first. The distinctive rattle of Maxim guns firing 600 rounds per minute swept across the boats. Bullets punched through wooden planking, ricocheted off metal fittings and found flesh. Men screamed. Others fell without a sound. Then the rifles joined in. Hundreds of Turkish soldiers from positions all along the ridges fired down into the packed boats. It was a massacre. Out. Everybody out! Officers yelled, their voices barely audible over the gunfire and the naval bombardment that was still thundering overhead. The boats grounded on the beach or, in many cases, stopped in chest-deep water 20 yards offshore. The ANZACs had no choice but to go over the sides into the water, weighted down by 60 pounds of equipment, under intense fire. Jack Morrison threw himself over the side of the boat and dropped into water that was shockingly cold. His boots touched bottom and he pushed forward, struggling against the weight of his pack and the drag of the water. Around him, men were falling. The water was being churned to foam by bullets. Tommy Chen, who'd been joking about Turkish coffee just minutes before, took a round through the throat. He made a gurgling sound and went down, the water around him turning dark. Jack reached for him instinctively, but a hand grabbed his shoulder. "Leave him," Sergeant Mackenzie shouted. "Get to the beach, move." Jack stumbled forward, every step expecting the bullet that would end his life. Somehow he made it to the sand and threw himself behind a boulder. Around him, other men were doing the same, finding whatever cover they could against the cliff face. The beach was chaos. More boats were arriving every minute, disgorging men into the killing zone. The wounded lay in the surf, some crying for help, others ominously silent. Equipment that had been carefully packed was abandoned, scattered across the beach. Officers tried to organize units that had become completely mixed up in the landing. And above it all, the cliffs loomed, 70 feet of near-vertical rock and scrub, with Turkish defenders firing down from the top. Aboard HMS Queen Elizabeth, Admiral de Robeck was receiving the first reports from the beach. The news was bad. The landing had gone wrong from the start. The troops were ashore but pinned down. Casualties were mounting. "Signal all ships," de Robeck ordered. "Maximum fire support. Engage all visible Turkish positions." The problem was identifying visible Turkish positions. The Turkish defenders weren't standing in the open. They were in trenches, behind rocks, in scrub so thick that even from a few hundred yards away they were invisible. The naval gunners were firing at puffs of smoke, at probable positions, at anywhere they thought the enemy might be. HMS Bacante, a cruiser, moved into point-blank range, less than 500 yards from shore. Her captain, seeing ANZACs pinned down on the beach, was determined to provide effective fire support, even if it meant exposing his ship to danger. "Load shrapnel," he ordered. Shrapnel shells were designed to burst above the target, showering the area with metal balls. Against troops in the open, they were devastating. The cruiser's 6-inch guns fired as fast as the crews could load them. Each gun crew was working in perfect synchronization. The breech opened, the spent case ejected, a new shell rammed home. The breech closed, the gun fired. 20 seconds per shot. Again and again and again. The noise was indescribable. Each shot produced a blast of flame and smoke, a crack that could be felt in the bones and a cloud of acrid smoke that made the crew's eyes water, but they kept firing. Men collapsed from exhaustion and were replaced. Gun barrels became so hot that water poured on them, sizzled and steamed. Still, they kept firing. And on the beach, the ANZACs could see the results. Shrapnel shells burst over. The Turkish trenches, the white puffs of smoke followed by the deadly rain of metal. Some Turkish positions fell silent. Others just kept firing. Lieutenant Colonel Sinclair McLagan, soaking wet and minus his cap, organized what he could of the shattered landing force. The beach was a death trap. Every minute spent here meant more casualties. The only way forward was up those cliffs. 3rd Battalion, you'll take the left gully, he shouted over the din. 2nd Battalion, center gully. Move fast, don't bunch up, and keep climbing until you reach the top. It was less a plan than a desperate improvisation, but it was all they had. Jack Morrison found himself in a group of about 30 men, mostly from different units, all heading for a narrow gully that cut through the cliff. The gully was steep, choked with scrub, and probably covered by Turkish fire. But it was the only way up. "Right, lads," said a lieutenant Jack didn't recognize. "We go fast and we don't stop. If a man goes down, leave him. Our job is to get to the top and clear the Turkish positions, so the rest of the brigade can get off that beach." "Ready, go." They started climbing. The gully was almost vertical in places, requiring them to scramble on hands and knees, grabbing at roots and rocks, their rifles slung across their backs. The scrub was a nightmare. Thick, thorny bushes that tore at their uniforms and skin, and the Turks were waiting. A machine gun opened up from somewhere above, the bullets snapping through the scrub. The man in front of Jack jerked and fell backward, tumbling down the gully. Another man screamed and clutched his shoulder. The lieutenant shouted, "Keep moving," and disappeared around a bend in the gully. Jack kept climbing. His legs burned. His lungs gasped for air. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool morning air. He didn't think about the Turks above or the men dying around him. He just focused on the next handhold, the next step, the next second of staying alive. After an eternity that was probably only 10 minutes, Jack scrambled over the lip of the gully onto a small plateau. Around him, perhaps 15 men from the original 30 had made it. They'd climbed about 300 yards from the beach, but the ridgeline, the real objective, was still another 200 yards higher. "Form a defensive line," the lieutenant ordered. "Watch for—" Turkish soldiers rose from a trench 20 yards away. For a heartbeat, both sides stared at each other in shock. Then everyone started shooting. Jack fired his rifle from the hip, not aiming, just pointing and pulling the trigger. The noise was tremendous. Men were shouting, screaming, cursing. The Turks came out of their trench with bayonets fixed. The ANZACs met them. What followed was warfare at its most primitive. Men fighting with bayonets, rifle butts, fists, anything they had. Jack shot a Turkish soldier at point-blank range, saw the man's look of surprise, then swung his rifle to parry another Turk's bayonet thrust. They grappled, fell, rolled on the ground. Jack got his hands around the man's throat and squeezed until the man stopped moving. When it was over, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute, the ANZACs held the position. Of the 15 who'd made it up the gully, 9 remained standing. Jack looked at his hands shaking uncontrollably and wondered who he'd become. What the ANZACs didn't fully appreciate in the chaos of battle was that they faced an enemy as brave and determined as themselves. The Turkish soldiers defending Gallipoli were fighting for their homeland, led by officers who understood the stakes perfectly. Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal, commander of the 19th Division, was resting several miles from the beach when the first reports of the landing reached him. A veteran of the Balkan Wars, Kemal was 34 years old, ambitious, and possessed of that rare quality in warfare, the ability to make quick decisions under pressure. Without waiting for orders from higher headquarters, Kemal ordered his regiment to move toward the sound of gunfire. As they quick marched toward the heights above ANZAC Cove, Kemal studied the situation. The invaders had gotten ashore and were pushing inland. If they reached the high ground and consolidated, they'd be almost impossible to dislodge. But if he could hit them now, while they were scattered and disorganized, he could drive them back into the sea. Arriving at the ridgeline above the ANZAC's positions, Kemal addressed his soldiers with words that would become legendary. "I don't order you to attack. I order you to die. In the time it takes us to die, other forces and commanders can come and take our place." It was a death sentence, and his soldiers knew it. Attacking downhill into enemy fire, they would be exposed and vulnerable. Many wouldn't survive, but they advanced anyway, driven by loyalty to their commander and their country. The Turkish counterattack came at 10 a.m., just as the ANZACs were trying to establish a defensive line. Waves of Turkish soldiers charged down the slopes, bayonets fixed, officers leading from the front. They came with courage and determination that matched the ANZAC's own. The fighting became apocalyptic. Jack Morrison and his dwindling group found themselves in an impossible position. Turkish soldiers were attacking from above. More ANZACs were trying to push up from below. And naval shells were exploding on all sides, some hitting Turkish positions, others landing dangerously close to the ANZACs. "Fall back," someone shouted, but there was nowhere to fall back to. Behind them was a cliff. Ahead were the Turks. They could only hunker down and fight. Sergeant Mackenzie, his face blackened with powder smoke, had somehow found them. "Right, boys, here's how it is," he said with remarkable calm, considering bullets were snapping past his head. "We hold this position. We dig in as best we can. The Navy's going to plaster the ridges, and then we push forward again. Sarge, we've got no shovels," someone pointed out. "Then use your bayonets, your helmets, your bare hands. I don't care. Make some cover or you'll be dead by afternoon." They dug with whatever they had, scraping shallow trenches in the rocky soil. It was desperate, back-breaking work under fire, but it was that or die. Meanwhile, on the beach, the situation remained critical. Thousands more ANZACs were coming ashore, but the beach was choked with men, equipment, and casualties. Turkish artillery had found the range, and shells were landing among the crowded troops. The wounded lay in rows, waiting for evacuation that was maddeningly slow. Medical officers worked frantically, but there were far more casualties than they could handle, and the naval gunfire, for all its sound and fury, wasn't solving the problem. The ships couldn't see their targets clearly. Communication with spotters ashore was sporadic. Many shells were falling behind the Turkish lines, doing little damage to the defenders who mattered. Aboard HMS Bacante, the gun crews were exhausted. They'd been firing for 6 hours straight. The decks were slippery with sweat and littered with spent shell casings. Several men had collapsed from heat exhaustion in the confined gun turrets, but still they kept firing because stopping meant abandoning the men ashore. The cruiser had taken hits too. Turkish artillery, firing from positions the ships couldn't locate, had struck Bacante 3 times. One shell had penetrated the upper works and exploded in a crew compartment, killing 3 sailors and wounding 7 more. Another had struck the armored belt and failed to penetrate, but the impact had knocked men off their feet throughout the ship. "Sir, we're down to 30% ammunition," the gunnery officer reported to the captain. "Then make every shot count," the captain replied. "Those boys on the beach need us. We don't stop until we're empty or sunk." By early afternoon, the situation had become desperate enough that the senior officers ashore began to consider the unthinkable: evacuation. The ANZACs held a precarious toehold, barely a half-mile deep under constant pressure. Casualties were mounting by the minute. The original objectives, the high ridges that dominated the peninsula, seemed impossibly distant. Colonel Sinclair McLagan, his uniform torn and blood-stained, made his way back to the beach to consult with other senior officers. What he found shocked even his battle-hardened sensibilities. The beach looked like a scene from hell. Wounded men lay everywhere, some crying for water, others silent in shock. The dead were being pulled from the surf and laid in rows. Equipment was scattered chaotically. Shells were still falling, killing men who'd thought themselves safe on the beach. "We can't sustain this," Sinclair McLagan told Brigadier General William Bridges, commander of the 1st Australian Division. "We're barely holding on. If the Turks mount a major coordinated push, they'll drive us into the sea." Bridges nodded grimly. He'd come to the same conclusion. "I'm recommending to General Birdwood that we evacuate while we still can. We've done all that's humanly possible. To stay means annihilation." The message was relayed to the fleet, where General Birdwood, the overall commander of the ANZAC Corps, faced the most difficult decision of his career. Evacuate and admit defeat, or hold on and risk losing the entire force? He drafted a message to General Sir Ian Hamilton, commanding the overall Gallipoli operation from his headquarters ship. It was brutally honest. "We are being pressed. Can we hold on? Situation precarious." Hamilton's reply came within hours. It was terse and uncompromising. "Dig, dig, dig until you are safe. You have got through the difficult business, now you have only to dig, dig, dig." There would be no evacuation. The ANZACs would hold or they would die trying. When word spread among the ANZACs that they were staying, that there would be no evacuation, the reaction was mixed. Some felt relief. They hadn't come all this way to retreat on the first day. Others felt only despair. They were trapped on a hostile shore with an enemy determined to throw them back into the sea. Jack Morrison, crouched in his shallow trench with water running low and ammunition lower, felt mostly numb. He'd been in combat for 12 hours. He'd killed men, how many, he couldn't say. He'd seen friends die. The boy who'd left Queensland looking for adventure was gone. What remained was someone harder, grimmer, focused entirely on survival. "Here they come again," someone shouted. Another Turkish attack was developing. Jack could see them coming down the slope. Perhaps 100 men, moving in short rushes from cover to cover, their officers urging them forward. "Wait for the order," Sergeant Mackenzie commanded. "Make every shot count, boys. Aim low." The ANZACs held their fire until the Turks were at 50 yards. Then on Mackenzie's command, they opened up with everything they had. Rifles cracked. A Lewis gun someone had managed to get up the cliff chattered. And from offshore, HMS Chelmer, a destroyer that had moved in dangerously close, opened fire with her 4-inch guns. The naval shells exploded among the attacking Turks with devastating effect. Shrapnel scythed through their ranks. The attack faltered, broke, and the survivors retreated back up the slope, dragging their wounded. "That's how you do it," Mackenzie shouted. "The Navy's with us, boys. We hold this ground." But everyone knew the truth. They'd stopped one attack. There would be more. And every attack wore them down a little more, killed a few more men, used up precious ammunition. The day wore on, each hour bringing fresh horrors. Turkish snipers hidden in the scrub picked off unwary men. Artillery shells continued to fall randomly. The sun beat down mercilessly and men started collapsing from heat exhaustion and thirst. The few water bottles that had made it ashore were empty or bullet-riddled, and through it all the naval guns kept firing. The destroyers rotated in and out, one taking the place of another when ammunition ran low or battle damage required repairs. The cruisers maintained a steady bombardment. The battleships, too large to operate close to shore in daylight, waited for nightfall to add their massive firepower. As the sun finally set on April 25, 1915, the exhausted ANZACs found themselves in control of a thin perimeter, roughly 3 miles long, and nowhere more than a mile deep. It wasn't the sweeping victory that had been planned. They hadn't captured the high ground. They hadn't cut off the Turkish forces. But they were ashore. They were alive. And they weren't going to be driven back into the sea. Jack Morrison sat in his trench as darkness fell, his rifle across his knees, too exhausted even to eat the bully beef in his pack. Around him, men were digging. Those who had no entrenching tools used bayonets, helmets, bare hands, anything to scrape out a few more inches of protection. "Reckon we'll see tomorrow?" asked a young private whose name Jack didn't know. The boy couldn't have been more than 18, his face still bearing the smoothness of youth beneath the grime and powder smoke. Jack wanted to say something reassuring, something hopeful. But he was too tired for lies. "We'll see it," he said. "Whether we'll see the day after that, I don't know. But the Navy's still out there, listen." They fell silent, and through the darkness came the thunder of heavy guns. The battleships, freed from the constraint of operating in daylight when Turkish shore batteries could target them, had moved in close. HMS Queen Elizabeth's 15-inch guns spoke with voices like the wrath of God, each blast lighting up the night sky. HMS Triumph and HMS Majestic added their firepower. The shells screamed overhead toward the Turkish lines. "Long as we've got them," Jack said, "we've got a chance." It was a slim hope, but it was all they had. Dawn on the 26th brought no respite. If anything, the situation seemed worse in daylight. The ANZACs could now clearly see how precarious their position was. They clung to steep, broken ground dominated by Turkish positions on the heights above. Every movement drew fire. There was no safe place in the entire perimeter. The beach remained a nightmare. More troops were coming ashore, bringing the total ANZAC strength to nearly 30,000 men. But they were crammed into an area barely large enough for half that number. Supply dumps grew haphazardly. Casualties continued to mount. And Turkish artillery, despite the naval bombardment, kept finding targets. Aboard HMS Bacante, now back on the gun line after a brief withdrawal to rearm and repair damage, Lieutenant Commander William Boyle watched the shore through his binoculars. He'd been firing in support of the ANZACs for over 30 hours now, with only brief breaks. His ship had expended over 800 rounds of 6-inch ammunition, nearly her entire wartime allocation for a month of operations. "Sir, we're receiving a request for fire mission," the signals officer reported. "Ground forces report Turkish troops massing for attack in Sector 5. Boyle consulted his map. Sector 5 was on the northern edge of the ANZAC perimeter, a place called Walker's Ridge. The ground forces wanted fire support, but the map coordinates put the target dangerously close to Australian positions. "How close are our troops to the target area?" Boyle asked. "Less than 200 yards, sir. It was too close. A slight error in aim, a malfunction in a fuse, a shell falling short. Any of these could kill the men they were trying to help. But if they didn't fire, the Turks might overwhelm the position. We'll use time fuses set for airburst," Boyle decided. "Tell the spotters to keep our troops' heads down. We'll bracket the target and adjust fire based on their observations. And get me the best gun crew we have on the forward turret." It was delicate, dangerous work. The cruiser fired slowly, deliberately, each shot carefully aimed based on spotting reports from shore. The first shell exploded 50 yards beyond the Turkish position. The second was 20 yards short. The third hit perfectly, the air burst scattering shrapnel across the Turkish assembly area. "Fire for effect," Boyle ordered. "All guns, rapid fire." The cruiser's 6-inch guns hammered the Turkish position for 10 minutes. When the smoke cleared, the attack had been broken before it could start. But Boyle knew they'd been lucky. Tomorrow or the next day they might not be so fortunate. On May 1st, the ANZACs received grim news. The British submarine AE-2 had been operating in the Sea of Marmara, behind Turkish lines, creating havoc among Turkish supply ships. Now she'd been sunk by a Turkish torpedo boat. The ANZACs felt the loss keenly. The submarine had been a symbol that the Allies could strike at the Turks anywhere, that the enemy wasn't invulnerable. But worse news was coming. German submarines, based in Austrian ports, were making their way toward the Dardanelles. The U-21, under the command of Kapitän Leutnant Otto Hersing, was a Type U-19 submarine, one of the most advanced in the German fleet. She carried 6 torpedoes and a crew determined to strike a blow against the Royal Navy. The British had grown complacent. The capital ships, the battleships and large cruisers operated with relatively little concern for submarine attack. They moved in predictable patterns, maintained fixed positions for extended periods while bombarding shore targets, and generally behaved as though the sea belonged to them. On May 13th, 21 reached the waters off Gallipoli. Hersing, studying the British fleet through his periscope, could hardly believe his luck. Battleships and cruisers were scattered across the sea, many of them stationary as they fired at shore targets. It was a target-rich environment. That night, the old battleship HMS Goliath was anchored off Cape Helles on the southern tip of the peninsula. She was providing fire support for British forces who had landed there separately from the ANZACs. At 1 a.m. on May 14th, U-21 crept close, Hersing fired 3 torpedoes. 2 struck home. HMS Goliath rolled over and sank in less than 3 minutes. Of her crew of 750, only 180 survived. The rest went down with the ship or died in the water, trapped below decks or pulled under by the suction as the ship went down. The news sent shockwaves through the fleet and the forces ashore. The battleships, symbols of British naval supremacy, the ships whose guns had provided crucial support, were vulnerable. If submarines could sink capital ships with such ease, nowhere was safe. The fleet changed its procedures immediately. Capital ships would no longer remain stationary for extended periods. They would move constantly, zigging and zagging unpredictably. Destroyer screens were reinforced. Anti-submarine patrols were increased, but U-21 was still hunting. On May 25th, HMS Triumph was on station off ANZAC Cove, her guns firing steadily at Turkish positions. The battleship was following the new procedures, moving slowly while firing, never remaining in one position for more than a few minutes. It wasn't enough. Jack Morrison, now a veteran of a month's constant fighting, was in a trench on a place called Courtney's Post when someone shouted and pointed toward the sea. He turned to look and saw something that would haunt his nightmares for years to come. HMS Triumph, barely a mile offshore, suddenly shuddered. A column of water erupted from her starboard side. The torpedo had struck amidships, tearing a massive hole in her hull. Jesus Christ, someone breathed. She's been torpedoed. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then slowly, majestically, Triumph began to list to starboard. The list increased faster and faster. Men could be seen abandoning ship, jumping from the tilting deck into the water. Boats were being lowered, but there wasn't time, there wasn't enough boats, there were too many men. 14 minutes after the torpedo struck, HMS Triumph rolled completely over and sank. Her hull, painted red with anti-fouling paint, was the last thing visible before she disappeared beneath the waves. Destroyers and small craft raced to pick up survivors. They saved many, over 600 men, but 73 sailors died in the sinking or drowned in the water. Without the big ships, what happens to us? Asked the private next to Jack, his voice tight with fear. Jack didn't have an answer. The battleships had been a constant presence, their guns a reassurance that the ANZACs weren't alone. Now, watching Triumph's survivors being pulled from the water, that reassurance was gone. 2 days later, U-21 struck again. HMS Majestic was anchored off Cape Helles, protected by anti-submarine nets, torpedo nets, and a screen of patrol boats. British naval officers had assured themselves that she was safe. The nets would stop any torpedo. The patrol boats would force any submarine to dive before it could get close enough to attack. They were wrong. Hersing approached underwater, navigating by sound and dead reckoning. The nets were there, but they had a gap, a channel for ship's boats to pass through. U-21 found the gap and slipped through. At 6:40 a.m., Hersing fired. The torpedo ran true, striking Majestic on her port side. Like Triumph, she listed rapidly. But unlike Triumph, Majestic's crew had been at action stations and her captain had practiced abandoned ship drills after watching Triumph go down. The evacuation was orderly. Boats were lowered, men went over the side in good order, officers remained at their posts until the last possible moment. When Majestic finally rolled over and sank, only 49 men died, a tragedy but far fewer than might have been. But the strategic impact was enormous. The British had lost 3 battleships in 2 weeks. Admiral de Robeck, shaken by the losses, ordered all capital ships withdrawn from the immediate area of the Dardanelles. They would retire to safer anchorages, coming forward only when absolutely necessary. For the ANZACs clinging to their precarious beachhead, it felt like abandonment. The big guns that had been their constant support were sailing away. Yes, the cruisers and destroyers remained, but everyone knew it wasn't the same. A destroyer's 4-inch gun was nothing compared to a battleship's 15-inch monster. The Turks, watching the British battleship steam away, knew it too. The tide was turning in their favor. Through June, the situation at ANZAC Cove evolved into something grimly familiar: trench warfare. The ANZACs and Turks faced each other across narrow no-man's lands, sometimes just yards apart. They threw grenades back and forth. Snipers killed unwary men. Neither side could advance, neither side could retreat. Jack Morrison, now a corporal after 3 sergeants in his unit had been killed, lived in a trench that was alternately baked by sun and flooded by occasional rains. Flies were everywhere, attracted by the unburied dead in no man's land. Disease spread: dysentery, typhoid, enteric fever. Men died of illness as often as from Turkish bullets. The naval gunfire continued, but it had become routine, almost background noise. Destroyers took turns on the gun line, firing scheduled bombardments at map coordinates. Sometimes they hit something useful, often they didn't. The Turks had learned to shelter deep in dugouts during bombardments, emerging unscathed when the firing stopped. The destroyers themselves were suffering. HMS Chelmer had been hit by shore fire 3 times, killing 7 sailors and wounding a dozen more. HMS Colne had struck a mine and limped back to port with major damage. HMS Ribble was showing signs of mechanical breakdown from constant operations at high stress. The crews were exhausted. Men who'd expected a few days of action followed by return to port were now in their 8th week of continuous operations. Sleep was scarce, food was monotonous, and the constant danger wore on nerves. But they kept firing because stopping meant abandoning the men ashore. In the trenches, warfare became intimate and personal. The lines were so close that men could hear the enemy talking, could smell their cigarette smoke, could recognize individual voices. Sniping became an art form. Both sides developed specialist snipers who scored dozens of kills. The ANZACs learned to move only at dawn or dusk, to never show the same silhouette twice, to use periscopes and mirrors rather than looking over the trench parapet. Jack Morrison had a close call when a Turkish sniper's bullet struck his helmet and knocked him unconscious. He woke up with a splitting headache and a crease across his helmet an inch deep. Half an inch lower and he'd have been dead. "You've got the devil's own luck, Jack," said his mate, a Queensland stockman named Bill Harris who'd survived from the landing day. "Luck runs out," Jack replied, touching the crease in his helmet. "Every man's got a bullet with his name on it. Mine just hasn't found me yet." It was a fatalistic philosophy, but it helped men cope with the randomness of death. A man could do everything right, keep his head down, follow the rules, be cautious, and still die from a random shell or a lucky sniper shot. Or a man could take crazy risks and survive. There was no pattern, no justice, just chance. The naval forces couldn't help much against snipers. You couldn't shell a single man with a rifle hidden in a gully. The big guns were for bigger targets: trench lines, supply dumps, artillery positions. Against individual snipers, the ANZACs were on their own, but the Navy helped in other ways. The monitors, HMS Roberts and HMS Raglan, had arrived to replace the withdrawn battleships. These were strange-looking vessels, flat and broad, designed specifically for coastal bombardment. They carried heavy guns on rotating turrets, could operate in shallow water, and had enough armor to shrug off most return fire. The monitors made the Turkish gunners' lives miserable. Whenever Turkish artillery opened fire, the monitors would respond with deliberate, accurate fire. Turkish guns that revealed their positions were quickly silenced. It wasn't dramatic, but it was effective. Slowly, the Turkish artillery became less aggressive, less willing to fire for fear of drawing the monitors' attention. By late July, British planners had accepted that the original landing strategy had failed. The ANZACs were stuck in a narrow perimeter with no hope of breaking out on their own. The British forces at Cape Helles were similarly stalled. Something dramatic was needed, a new offensive that would break the stalemate. The plan they devised was ambitious. Fresh divisions would land at Suvla Bay, north of Anzac Cove, while the ANZACs launched a breakout attack toward a height called Chunuk Bair. If both attacks succeeded, they'd control the high ground and could finally advance down the peninsula. The naval forces would provide the largest bombardment yet. Every available ship would participate. Monitors, cruisers, destroyers, even some battleships brought forward specially for the operation. They would fire thousands of shells in a preparatory bombardment that would, planners hoped, obliterate the Turkish defenses. Aboard HMS Canopus, a pre-dreadnought battleship that had been relegated to coastal bombardment duties, Captain Lockyer reviewed the fire plan with his officers. It was staggeringly complex. The ship would fire over 400 12-inch shells over 3 days, targeting specific Turkish positions, communication trenches, supply routes, and headquarters locations. "Gentlemen, this is what we've been building toward," Lockyer told his officers. "If this offensive succeeds, we break the stalemate. If it fails," he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew that failure would mean evacuation and defeat. At 5:30 p.m. on August 6th, the bombardment began. Every ship available opened fire simultaneously. The noise was beyond description. a continuous thunder that could be heard 20 miles away that shook the ground. That made rational thought impossible. HMS Canopus fired her 12-inch guns as fast as the crews could load them. Each gun had a crew of 15 men working in perfect coordination. The shells, each weighing 850 pounds, had to be hauled from the magazine, loaded into the gun, aimed, and fired. It was exhausting work in the cramped, hot gun turrets. Men stripped to the waist, their bodies running with sweat, their ears protected by cotton wool that did little to muffle the tremendous noise. The monitors added their fire. HMS Roberts, with her 9-inch guns, engaged Turkish artillery positions with methodical precision. HMS Raglan pounded the communication trenches that the Turks would use to bring up reinforcements. The destroyers, operating as close to shore as they dared, provided rapid fire against trenches and strong points. Their 4-inch guns couldn't penetrate deep dugouts, but they could destroy sandbag parapets, cut barbed wire, and suppress any Turkish soldiers trying to man their positions. The cruisers concentrated on specific targets: a Turkish headquarters, an ammunition dump, a supply depot. Their 6-inch shells could reduce buildings to rubble and set off secondary explosions when they hit something flammable. For 3 hours, the bombardment continued without pause. Then at 8:30 p.m. the ANZACs attacked. Jack Morrison, along with thousands of other ANZACs, went over the top into the darkness. The plan called for a night attack, using the cover of darkness to cross no man's land and reach the Turkish trenches before the defenders could react. It was a sound plan in theory. In practice, it was chaos from the start. The terrain was a nightmare in daylight. At night, it was almost impossible. Men stumbled into gullies, lost contact with their units, wandered in circles. The bombardment had torn up the ground, leaving shell craters and debris everywhere. The scrub, thick before the bombardment, was now a tangled mess of broken branches and exposed roots. And the Turks, despite the bombardment, were ready. They'd sheltered in deep dugouts during the shelling and emerged when it stopped. Now they manned their trenches and waited for the attack they knew was coming. Jack's unit, what remained of it after 3 months of fighting, advanced toward a position called Lone Pine. The naval gunfire had supposedly destroyed the Turkish trenches there. The ANZACs would assault, capture the position, and hold it while other units pushed toward the heights. They reached the Turkish trenches and found them still very much intact. The Turks had covered their trenches with logs and earth, turning them into tunnels that the shells couldn't penetrate. The ANZACs had to literally break through the roof of the trenches to get at the defenders. What followed was some of the most savage fighting of the entire war. Men fought hand-to-hand in the confined space of the trenches. They shot at each other from inches away. They bayoneted, clubbed, and strangled. It was butchery, pure and simple. Jack found himself in a tunnel so narrow he could barely move. A Turkish soldier came at him with a bayonet. Jack parried with his rifle, and they grappled in the darkness. The Turk was strong, younger than Jack, desperate. They fell, rolled, fought with the ferocity of animals. Jack got his hands on a rock and brought it down on the Turk's head, again and again, until the man stopped moving. When the sun rose on August 7th, the ANZACs held Lone Pine. They'd suffered over 2,000 casualties in 12 hours of fighting. The Turks had lost as many or more. And strategically, Lone Pine meant almost nothing. It was a small position far from the real objective of the high ground. Meanwhile, the fresh divisions landing at Suvla Bay were supposed to have marched inland and captured the heights before the Turks could react. Instead, they dallied on the beach, their commanders uncertain and hesitant. By the time they finally moved inland, Turkish reinforcements had arrived. The naval gunfire at Suvla was hampered by poor intelligence and communication. The ships fired at the beaches to cover the landing, but once the troops moved inland, the gunfire became less effective. Ships couldn't see what was happening behind the coastal ridges. Radio communication was unreliable. Visual signals were often misunderstood. HMS Grafton, a cruiser providing fire support, received a request to bombard a hill marked as Hill 10 on the map. The problem was there were several hills that might fit that description. The ship's gunnery officer picked the most likely target and opened fire. 20 minutes later, an urgent message arrived. They were shelling British troops. The Hill 10 that needed bombardment was a different hill entirely. Such confusion was typical of the operation. Good intentions, brave men, modern weapons, but without effective communication and coordination, they achieved little. The main ANZAC attack aimed at Chunuk Bair, a height that dominated the entire peninsula. If they could capture and hold it, the entire strategic situation would change. They'd command the high ground, could bring artillery forward, and finally break the stalemate. The attack was launched at night on August 6th, with the objective to reach the summit by dawn on August 7th. New Zealand troops, some of the finest soldiers in the ANZAC force, led the assault. They advanced through a maze of gullies and ridges, using the darkness to cover their movement. Turkish resistance was fierce but scattered. By dawn on August 7th, they'd almost reached the summit. One more push and they'd have it, but the attack had taken longer than planned. Dawn found them still climbing, exposed on the slopes. Turkish fire increased. The assault stalled. The naval forces did everything they could to help. HMS Bacante, back on the gun line after a month of repairs, fired over 300 rounds in support of the assault. Monitors pounded Turkish positions. Destroyers provided close-in fire support. On August 8th, the New Zealanders finally reached the summit. For a few brief hours, they held the most important piece of terrain on the entire peninsula. From the summit, they could see across to the Dardanelles, could see the waters they'd been trying to reach for 3 months. But they were exhausted, low on ammunition, and unsupported. The units that were supposed to reinforce them hadn't arrived. Turkish counterattacks came quickly, supported by artillery that the naval forces couldn't suppress because the Turkish guns were on the reverse slopes. Invisible from the ships, by August 10th, the Turks had retaken Chunuk Bair. The last, best chance to break the stalemate was gone. The August offensive cost the Allies over 25,000 casualties in less than a week. The ANZACs alone suffered nearly 12,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Entire battalions were reduced to a few dozen men. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. The beaches were piled with wounded waiting for evacuation. The naval forces had expended tens of thousands of shells. HMS Canopus had fired her entire wartime ammunition allocation in 3 days. Her gun barrels were worn smooth and would need replacing. Other ships were in similar condition. The destroyers that had been operating continuously since April were showing signs of mechanical breakdown. And for all this effort, all this sacrifice, the strategic situation was unchanged. The ANZACs still clung to their narrow beachhead. The Turks still held the high ground. The Dardanelles remained closed. Jack Morrison, one of the few men from his original battalion still alive and on duty, sat in a captured Turkish trench and tried to comprehend what had happened. They'd done everything asked of them. They'd attacked with courage, fought with determination, suffered terrible losses. The Navy had bombarded the Turkish positions until their guns wore out, and they'd achieved nothing. What was it all for? Asked Bill Harris, his voice empty of emotion. Harris had been at Gallipoli since the landing. He'd seen hundreds of friends die. He'd killed dozens of men himself. He was 24 years old and looked 50. Jack didn't answer because there was no answer. War didn't care about purpose or meaning. It just ground men up and kept going. Through September and October, reality slowly penetrated the optimistic assessments of British planners. The Gallipoli campaign had failed. The Turks would not be defeated. The Dardanelles would not be forced. Russia would not be saved. All the strategic objectives had proven impossible, but accepting failure and acting on it were two different things. No general wanted to be the one to recommend evacuation, to admit that 9 months of fighting, over 100,000 casualties, and vast expenditure had been for nothing. The decision was eventually forced by weather and logistics. Winter was coming, and the Gallipoli Peninsula in winter was brutally cold. The ANZACs, still living in trenches with minimal shelter, would suffer terribly. Supply ships could barely maintain the current garrison in summer conditions. In winter storms, they might not be able to reach the beaches at all, and there was a new theater demanding attention. British forces were in trouble in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. Troops were needed elsewhere. The resources tied up at Gallipoli were needed for other operations. In late October, the British government authorized planning for evacuation. It would be one of the most dangerous operations of the war, withdrawing tens of thousands of men from beaches under enemy observation, under enemy fire, with the risk of Turkish attack at any moment. The Navy would have to pull off a miracle. Rear Admiral Roslin Wemyss, appointed to oversee the naval aspects of the evacuation, faced a seemingly impossible task. The ANZACs held a perimeter 3 miles long and barely a mile deep. The Turks held all the high ground and could observe everything happening on the beaches. If they realized an evacuation was underway, they could launch an attack that would turn the withdrawal into a massacre. The historical precedent was grim. Retreats under fire typically resulted in catastrophic casualties. Wellington's retreat to Corunna in 1809 had cost thousands of lives. More recently, the Russian retreat from East Prussia in 1914 had been disastrous. Withdrawing under enemy observation across open beaches with limited transport, every military professional knew it would be a bloodbath. Wemyss and his staff worked out an elaborate deception plan. The withdrawal would happen gradually over several weeks, moving men out at night, while maintaining the appearance of normal garrison strength. Automatic rifles would be rigged to fire on timers, keeping up the sound of activity in the trenches. Fires would be lit on schedule to suggest normal occupation. Everything would be done to maintain the illusion that the ANZACs were staying. The naval forces would maintain their usual bombardment schedule right up until the last minute. Destroyers would provide close-in support and evacuation capacity. Larger ships would be offshore, ready to engage any Turkish forces that attempted to interfere. Captain Erich Busch of HMS Köln, promoted after his destroyer's earlier service at the landing, was one of the officers tasked with the final evacuation. He studied the beaches and the Turkish positions, calculating timing, tide states, moonlight conditions. "We'll need perfect coordination," he told his officers. "Every boat needs to know exactly when and where to go. One mistake, one boat in the wrong place, and we could alert the Turks." "Sir, the odds of pulling this off without casualties—" "I know," Busch interrupted. "Everyone expects this to be a disaster. Our job is to prove them wrong." Starting in mid-November, the ANZACs began what they called the thinning out. Small groups of men were withdrawn each night. A few dozen here, 100 there. Never enough to be obvious, but steadily reducing the garrison strength. Jack Morrison and Bill Harris were among the men selected for evacuation in the first group. After nearly 8 months at Gallipoli, they were among the longest-serving survivors. They knew every trench, every gully, every sniper position. They were also physically and mentally exhausted, worn down by constant stress, poor food, and chronic illness. "They're getting us out early because we're more valuable as trainers for new recruits than as corpses in a Turkish trench," Harris said cynically as they prepared to leave. Jack looked back at the trenches they'd lived in for so long. He thought of all the men who weren't leaving, the ones buried in shallow graves, the ones still listed as missing, the ones whose bodies lay unrecovered in no man's land. "Seems wrong to leave them," he said quietly. "They're past caring, mate. We're the lucky ones. Let's not waste it." They left that night, making their way down to the beach in darkness, moving silently past trenches that were still manned by other ANZACs who didn't yet know they'd be leaving too. Boats waited at the water's edge, their crews ready to row them out to the destroyers offshore. As Jack climbed into the boat, he heard the sound of naval gunfire. HMS Roberts was firing one of her regular bombardments, the sound so familiar it was almost comforting. The Turks would hear those guns and assume everything was normal. They wouldn't know that the ANZACs were slipping away. By December 18th, only 10,000 ANZACs remained in the positions that had once held 40,000. The trenches that had been crowded now echoed with emptiness. But from Turkish positions, everything appeared normal. Fires burned on schedule. Rifle fire continued. The naval bombardment maintained its usual pattern. The final withdrawal was planned for the night of December 19th, 20th. Every remaining ANZAC would leave in a single night. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. If the Turks discovered what was happening, they could attack and potentially trap thousands of men on the beaches. The last men out were engineers and specialists who'd rigged elaborate deception devices. Rifles were propped up in trenches, their triggers connected to candles that would burn down and fire the weapon, maintaining the sound of activity for hours after the trenches were empty. Fires were set with slow fuses to flare up at midnight, at 2 a.m., at 4 a.m. Supply dumps were rigged to explode, creating confusion and drawing Turkish attention away from the beaches. At 9 p.m., the withdrawal began. Men left their trenches in groups of 50, moving silently down paths they'd walked hundreds of times. They'd been ordered to leave almost everything behind. Just rifles, minimal ammunition, water bottles. Everything else would be abandoned. The beaches were organized chaos carefully controlled. Officers with clipboards checked off names, directed men to specific boats, ensured every available craft was filled to capacity but not overloaded. The destroyers offshore waited with engines running, ready to extract the men and disappear into the darkness. Aboard HMS Colon, Captain Bush watched the beaches through binoculars. He could see the dark shapes of men moving to the water's edge, see the boats filling and pulling away. Everything was going according to plan, but he wouldn't relax until the last man was aboard and they were clear of Turkish guns. "How many left ashore?" he asked. "Less than 1,000, sir. They should all be off by 3 a.m. Bush nodded but didn't reply. 3 hours. A lot could go wrong in 3 hours. The Turks could realize what was happening. They could attack. A boat could capsize or break down. One loud noise, one mistake could turn success into disaster. The hours crawled by. Midnight came and went. The rigged rifles began firing, the sound carrying across the still night air. To Turkish listeners, it would sound like normal trench activity. The slow fuse fires began lighting up, making the trenches look occupied. At 2:30 a.m., the last troops left the trenches. Engineers checked the demolition charges one final time, set the timers, and hurried toward the beach. The destroyers moved in as close as they dared, their crews ready to provide covering fire if needed. At 3:45 a.m., the last boat pushed off from ANZAC Cove. Aboard were the final engineers and the beachmaster who'd coordinated the entire operation. Behind them, the trenches stood empty, rifles propped against sandbags, fires burning, everything suggesting normal occupation, but there wasn't a single Allied soldier left on the beach. As the sun rose on December 20th, 1915, Turkish patrols began their usual morning routine. Officers scanned the ANZAC trenches through binoculars, looking for targets of opportunity. Everything appeared normal at first glance. Fires burning, occasional movement, the sound of distant voices. But something was different. The usual morning activity, men cooking breakfast, sentries changing shifts, officers moving between positions, was absent. The more experienced Turkish officers felt it first, a wrongness they couldn't quite define. At 7 a.m., a Turkish patrol cautiously approached an ANZAC trench. They expected fire. Instead, they found emptiness. The trench was deserted. Rifles were propped against the parapet, connected to burned-down candles. Food was still in the cooking pots. But there were no men. The realization spread quickly. The ANZACs were gone. All of them. The entire position, 3 miles of trenches, dozens of strong points, was empty. The evacuation had been a complete success. Turkish soldiers moved through the abandoned positions, finding equipment, ammunition, supplies, everything except the men they'd been fighting for 8 months. Some took souvenirs. Others just stood in the empty trenches, marveling at the feat they'd witnessed. Mustafa Kemal, who'd commanded the Turkish defense with such skill, reportedly said, "They came as friends and they left as friends. We will remember them with respect." It was one of the few gracious moments in a brutal campaign. The numbers told a story of futility and sacrifice that would echo through generations. The ANZAC forces suffered 26,111 casualties at Gallipoli, 8,709 killed, 19,441 wounded. The British Empire forces as a whole lost over 141,000 men. The French lost 47,000. And the Turks, defending their homeland with courage equal to their attackers, suffered at least 250,000 casualties, though exact numbers were never confirmed. For what? The Dardanelles remained closed. Turkey stayed in the war. Russia never received the supplies the campaign was meant to deliver. The strategic objectives that had seemed so achievable in London war rooms proved impossible on the steep ridges of Gallipoli. But wars are measured not just in strategic success or failure, but in their impact on the people and nations involved. And by that measure, Gallipoli changed everything. For the Royal Navy, Gallipoli was a harsh education in the limitations of sea power. The Navy had dominated the world's oceans for 2 centuries, defeating Napoleon's fleets, enforcing the Pax Britannica, projecting British power to every corner of the globe. British officers had believed, with some justification, that their ships were invincible. Gallipoli shattered that confidence. 3 battleships sunk by submarines, shore batteries that couldn't be silenced, naval gunfire that looked impressive but achieved limited results against determined defenders in well-prepared positions. The mighty dreadnoughts, which represented the pinnacle of military technology and national prestige, had proven vulnerable and in many situations ineffective. Admiral Sir John Fisher, who had warned against the operation from the start, was proven tragically correct. The Dardanelles will be our grave, he'd predicted. While the Navy survived the campaign, its reputation for invincibility did not. But the Navy also learned valuable lessons that would save thousands of lives in future operations. The techniques developed for amphibious landings, for naval gunfire support, for ship-to-shore communication, for evacuation under fire, all of these would be studied and refined. 27 years later, when Allied forces landed in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy, they would use doctrine developed from the painful lessons of Gallipoli. The evacuation itself became a case study in military excellence. To withdraw 45,000 men from under the noses of an alert enemy without a single casualty was remarkable. It required meticulous planning, perfect execution, and no small amount of luck. But it proved that even in defeat, properly led forces could achieve extraordinary things. Captain Eric Bush, who commanded HMS Culm during both the landing and evacuation, later wrote, "We failed in our strategic objective, but we succeeded in proving that British sailors and soldiers, when properly led and supported, could achieve things thought impossible." The evacuation was the one bright spot in a campaign of darkness. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became something more than a military campaign. It became the crucible in which their national identities were forged. Before Gallipoli, Australia was a federation of former colonies just 14 years old. New Zealand was even younger as a unified nation. Their armies were small, untested, their military traditions borrowed from Britain. They were colonial forces, respected but not equal to regular British troops in the eyes of many British officers. Gallipoli changed that. The ANZACs proved they could fight as well as any soldiers in the world. They could endure hardship, show initiative, fight with courage and determination. British officers who'd initially been skeptical of these colonials came to regard them as elite troops. More importantly, Australians and New Zealanders came to see themselves differently. They'd proven themselves on the world stage. They'd fought for values they believed in: loyalty, mateship, duty. They'd shown that young nations could produce men equal to any challenge. April 25th, the anniversary of the landing, became ANZAC Day, a national day of remembrance in both countries. It's observed with dawn services, marches, the wearing of rosemary for remembrance. It's a day when Australians and New Zealanders reflect on what their nations stand for and honor the men who died in defining those values. Jack Morrison returned to his family's sheep station in Queensland. He rarely spoke about Gallipoli, but every April 25th he would wake before dawn, dress in his old uniform, which hung loose on his frame — he never regained the weight he lost at Gallipoli — and stand facing northeast toward Turkey. His family knew not to disturb him during those hours. He lived to be 73, dying in 1966. Among his possessions, his children found a battered diary he'd kept at Gallipoli. The entries were terse, matter-of-fact, often just weather reports and casualty numbers. But on one page dated December 20th, 1915, he'd written more. "Left Anzac Cove tonight. 8 months I've been in these trenches. Lost most of my mates: Tommy, Pete, Jack Collins, Bill Wright, so many I can't remember all their names. We failed to take the heights. Failed in everything we came to do, but we didn't fail each other. We held the line when we were told to hold. We attacked when we were told to attack. We never quit. That's got to count for something. That's got to mean something." For Turkey, Gallipoli was a defining moment of different sort. The Ottoman Empire was crumbling, had been the sick man of Europe for decades. Many believed it would collapse under Allied attack. The Gallipoli campaign was meant to hasten that collapse. Instead, Turkey's successful defense breathed new life into Turkish nationalism. Mustafa Kemal, the lieutenant colonel who'd led the crucial counterattack on April 25th, became a national hero. His rise to prominence began at Gallipoli and would eventually lead to him becoming Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey. The Ottoman Empire did eventually fall, but not because of Gallipoli. When it did, Kemal led the Turkish nationalist movement that established the Republic of Turkey. He'd proven at Gallipoli that Turks could defeat European powers, that the empire's weakness wasn't inevitable, that with proper leadership and determination, Turks could achieve great things. In Turkey, the Gallipoli campaign is remembered as Çanakkale Savaşı, the Battle of Çanakkale. It's celebrated as a great victory, a moment when Turkey stood against the greatest empires in the world and won. The battlefields are preserved, the Turkish defenders honored, and Kemal's words to his soldiers, "I don't order you to attack. I order you to die," are taught to every schoolchild. Ironically, both sides remember Gallipoli with pride. The ANZACs for their courage in impossible circumstances, the Turks for their successful defense of their homeland. It's one of the few battles where losers and winners alike can claim to have proven something important about themselves. The ships that supported the Gallipoli campaign went on to varied fates. HMS Queen Elizabeth, the most powerful battleship in the world in 1915, served throughout World War I and into World War II, finally being scrapped in 1948 after 34 years of service. HMS Bacante, the cruiser that had fought so close to shore at ANZAC Cove, was sent to the scrapyard in 1918, worn out by constant service. HMS Colne and HMS Chelmer, destroyers that had operated in the most dangerous waters off the beaches, survived the war and were scrapped in the 1920s. The monitors HMS Roberts and HMS Raglan had shorter lives. Roberts was sunk by shore batteries in the Aegean in 1916. Raglan was torpedoed and sunk by a German submarine in St. But perhaps the most poignant fate belonged to HMS Majestic and HMS Triumph. The battleships that were sunk off Gallipoli by U-21 still lie on the bottom of the Aegean, their hulls now colonized by marine life, their guns silent forever. Their war graves, protected sites where the crews who went down with the ships still rest. Divers who visited the wrecks report an eerie feeling. The ships are intact, lying on their sides in relatively shallow water. You can see the gun turrets, the armor belt, the superstructure. You can imagine the men who served aboard, who ate in the mess halls, slept in the hammocks, served the guns. And you remember that 622 men died when these two ships sank. Men who'd thought themselves safe aboard the most powerful warships in the world. In 2015, on the 100th anniversary of the landing, over 10,000 Australians and New Zealanders made the pilgrimage to Gallipoli for the dawn service. They gathered on the beach where their great-grandfathers had landed a century before, in the darkness before dawn, as their ancestors had done. The beach is changed now. There's a memorial, paved paths, gardens. The cliffs that seemed so impossible to climb are still steep but tamed by steps and railings. The Turkish trenches have been preserved, the ANZAC trenches marked. It's peaceful, beautiful even. Hard to imagine as a place of such horror. As dawn broke on April 25, 2015, the crowd stood silent. Some wept. Others just gazed at the cliffs and tried to imagine what their ancestors had faced. The Turkish military band played the last post, the haunting bugle call that honors the fallen. A moment of silence followed. Then the Turkish president spoke, echoing words that Kemal Ataturk had written in 1934 to the mothers of the ANZACs. Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives. You are now lying in the soil of a friendly country, therefore rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us where they lie side by side here in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. It was a moment of reconciliation, of remembering shared sacrifice rather than old enmities. The Turks who had fought so fiercely against the ANZACs now welcomed their descendants as honored guests. The ANZACs who had invaded Turkey now came in peace to remember and honor both their own dead and their former enemies. Gallipoli changed naval warfare forever. Never again would admirals believe that ships alone could win a campaign against a determined land-based enemy. Never again would they underestimate the importance of detailed planning for amphibious operations. Never again would they commit capital ships to confined waters where submarines could operate. The campaign demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of naval gunfire support. Done right, with good intelligence, effective communication, and realistic expectations, naval guns could provide crucial support to ground forces. Done wrong, with poor planning, inadequate reconnaissance, and unrealistic hopes, they were just expensive fireworks. Most importantly, Gallipoli taught that technology alone doesn't win wars. Britain had the most powerful navy in the world, the most advanced weapons, the resources of a global empire. Turkey was a declining power with outdated equipment and limited resources. On paper, it should have been no contest, but the Turks had what the British lacked: intimate knowledge of the terrain, defensive positions prepared over months, and the tremendous advantage of fighting for their homeland. They also had in Mustafa Kemal, a commander of genius who could read a battlefield situation and react instantly. These factors, terrain, preparation, leadership, and will, proved more important than technological superiority. It's a lesson military planners have had to relearn repeatedly, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Superior firepower doesn't guarantee victory against a determined enemy, fighting on their own ground. As the dawn service concluded on that 100th anniversary, an elderly Australian veteran of World War II, himself now over 90, was asked what Gallipoli meant to modern Australians. He thought for a long moment, gazing at the memorial stones bearing thousands of names. Then he said, "It's about remembering that courage and sacrifice matter, that there are things worth fighting for, even if you know you might not win, that how you face adversity defines who you are as a nation and as individuals. Those boys who landed here 100 years ago, they didn't quit even when the situation was hopeless. They didn't abandon their mates. They did their duty as they understood it, and they paid a terrible price for it. We honor them not because they won, they didn't, but because of how they fought and what they stood for. Loyalty, mateship, courage, sacrifice. These aren't just words. They're the values that define us as Australians. Gallipoli is where we first proved we had those values, where we first showed the world who we were. That's why we come back here, generation after generation, to remember, to honor, and to remind ourselves of what we should aspire to be." It was as good an explanation as any for why Gallipoli matters, a century after the guns fell silent. The naval guns that thundered off ANZAC Cove from April to December 1915 fired approximately 3 million shells. They consumed hundreds of thousands of tons of explosives. They wore out gun barrels, exhausted crews, and achieved far less than their commanders hoped. But they also saved thousands of lives. Every Turkish attack broken up by naval gunfire was an attack that didn't reach the ANZAC trenches. Every Turkish supply dump destroyed meant fewer shells falling on the beach. Every Turkish artillery position silenced meant fewer casualties among the troops. And when the time came to evacuate, the naval forces made possible what everyone thought impossible: getting out without a massacre. The ships and the men who served aboard them were as much heroes of Gallipoli as the soldiers who fought in the trenches. They faced danger every day, from submarines, mines, shore batteries, and mechanical breakdown. They worked to exhaustion in the heat of gun turrets and engine rooms. They watched battleships sink and comrades die, but they never quit, never abandoned the men they'd brought to that hostile shore. Jack Morrison, in his diary entry on the night of evacuation, understood this. He wrote, "The Navy brought us here, stayed with us through all the hell, and got us out alive. We failed to take the heights, but the Navy never failed us." That's worth remembering. Today, when Australian and New Zealand naval ships pass through the Dardanelles, now as guests and allies of Turkey, they often slow and sound their horns in salute to the men who fought and died there. Turkish naval vessels return the salute. It's a tradition that honors both the courage of those who fought and the peace that eventually followed the war. The beaches of ANZAC Cove are quiet now. The guns are silent. The trenches are empty, but the echoes remain, in the ceremonies held every April 25th, in the stories passed down through generations, in the values that were forged in those terrible 8 months. The landing at ANZAC Cove was a military failure, but the courage shown there by sailors and soldiers of both sides helped define nations and change history. That's the paradox of Gallipoli, a defeat that became a source of pride, a failure that produced heroes, a disaster that gave birth to lasting values. As long as people value courage, sacrifice, and loyalty, Gallipoli will be remembered. As long as nations honor those who serve, the dawn services will continue. And as long as we remember that how we face our hardest challenges defines us, the story of ANZAC Cove will matter. The guns have been silent for over a century, but their echo still resounds, reminding us of what humanity is capable of, both the horror we can inflict and the heroism we can achieve.